As the coffin was about to be placed into the cremation furnace, a strange sound suddenly emerged. When the staff opened the coffin lid, the scene inside shocked them to the core, prompting them to call the police. Arthur adjusted his tie for the third time, his fingers betraying the calm exterior he was trying to project. He glanced at his watch again. The ticking felt louder than the soft hum of whispered prayers around him, louder than the creak of the old wooden benches as mourners shifted uncomfortably. He couldn't help it. His eyes kept darting to the ornate coffin at the front of the crematorium chapel. Inside that box lay Madeline, his wife, though he now thought of her as an obstacle finally removed. The thought should have soothed him, but instead, a small kernel of unease burrowed deeper into his gut every time his gaze lingered too long on the polished mahogany. "Arthur," whispered a voice to his left. It was Nina, one of the two women who had accompanied him today. She leaned closer, her perfume a little too sweet in the heavy, floral-scented air. "You're making it obvious. Stop looking so—" She hesitated, searching for the word. "So shifty." He straightened abruptly. "I'm not shifty," he hissed, keeping his voice low as Father Michael's droned on in the background. The priest's words flowed steadily, a comforting lull for the grieving, though Arthur wasn't grieving. He forced his shoulders to relax, adding, "It's just, these things are unpleasant." Nina's eyes narrowed. "You better hold it together. We're almost there." The almost conspiratorial exchange went unnoticed by most of the mourners, except for one elderly woman in the back row who turned her head slightly. She seemed to study Arthur for a beat longer than was polite before refocusing on her prayer book. Arthur didn't notice her. His attention was drawn once again to the coffin. A sudden shuffle near the front drew everyone's eyes. A man, some cousin of Madeline's, Arthur thought, was leaning forward, his brow furrowed. Did anyone see that?" he muttered, his voice just loud enough to carry. He was pointing at the coffin, his hand trembling slightly. "I thought—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Never mind." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room like a low wave, but Arthur acted quickly. He stepped forward, his voice steady, commanding. "It's the candles," he said, his tone dismissive but not unkind. "The flickering light can play tricks on the eyes. Let's not disrupt the service." The man hesitated, glancing around as if seeking validation for what he'd seen, or thought he'd seen. But under Arthur's steady gaze, he shrank back into his seat, muttering an apology. Arthur turned to Father Michaels, who had paused in his sermon, his hands folded patiently. "Please, Father," Arthur said, his expression carefully composed. "Continue." The priest nodded and resumed, though the slight arch of his brow betrayed his curiosity. Arthur returned to his place by the coffin, standing just close enough to discourage anyone else from approaching. The service continued, and the room settled into an uneasy stillness. Yet Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that the coffin's presence was more oppressive than it should have been. It wasn't just grief. It was something heavier. Something alive. When the ceremony ended, mourners began filing out quietly, their footsteps muffled against the chapel's thick carpet. Arthur stayed behind, watching as the attendants prepared to move Madeline's coffin to the cremation chamber. His companions, Nina and the other woman, Eleanor, lingered nearby. "She's finally gone," Eleanor said softly, almost as if to herself. Her words carried a faint edge of triumph, though her expression remained neutral. Arthur allowed himself a small smile, the first genuine one he'd worn all day. "Yes," he replied, his voice low. "It's done." The attendants rolled the coffin onto a narrow conveyor belt, the wheels squeaking slightly in the quiet room. The sound made Arthur's smile falter. His heart gave an involuntary thud as the coffin lurched slightly before settling back onto the belt. He forced himself to remain calm, standing straighter as the attendants prepared the final step. Everything had gone according to plan. There was no reason to feel uneasy now. And yet, as the coffin began its slow journey toward the heavy steel doors leading to the furnace, Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. It was just nerves, he told himself, just the weight of everything that had happened. But when the doors closed with a muted clang and the room was silent once more, he exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. Behind him, Nina spoke quietly. "That's it then?" Arthur nodded. "That's it." He turned to leave, feeling a lightness that hadn't been there moments before. He'd done it. He was free. Free of Madeline, free of her accusing eyes and her inconvenient questions, free to claim everything she had once kept from him. The mechanical hum of the conveyor belt slowed to a stop, its groan echoing faintly in the narrow room beyond the chapel. George wiped his hands on his stained coveralls, his heavy boots scuffing the cement floor as he moved toward the last coffin. Beside him, Steve, a lanky man with a faded tattoo snaking up his forearm, leaned lazily against the wall, chewing on the end of an unlit cigarette. "Last one for the day," George muttered, more to himself than to his companion. Steve grunted in response, pushing off the wall. He strolled over, his fingers tapping absently on the side of the polished wood. "Fancy coffin," he remarked. "Whoever's in here must have cost someone a pretty penny." George didn't reply, already focused on adjusting the metal bracket that secured the coffin to the belt. The furnace room was quiet now, the earlier hum of activity having given way to the kind of stillness that made Steve's skin itch. He hated this part of the job. Being alone with the dead, the air thick with an odd mix of burnt ash and flowers. As Steve moved to help, a sound froze him in place. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, a soft, sharp noise like a stifled cough or a sneeze. Steve's hand hovered over the coffin lid, his face twisting in confusion. "You hear that?" George shot him a look, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" "That, I swear." Steve leaned closer, pressing his ear against the coffin. For a moment, there was only silence, and then there it was again. A muffled, delicate sound, like a breath struggling to escape. George stood straighter, his stomach knotting. "Quit messing around," he barked, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not," Steve snapped, stepping back, his face pale. He pointed a shaky finger at the coffin. "It came from in there." George hesitated, glancing at the sealed edges of the lid. His mind raced through possibilities, rats, an echo, maybe the damned thing settling on the belt. But deep down, something colder, sharper, clawed at his chest. "Open it," Steve whispered, his voice low but urgent. "You're crazy," George shot back. But the sound came again, faint but undeniable, a soft rasp that sent chills skittering down both their spines. Without another word, George reached for the latch. His hands trembled slightly as he worked the mechanism, and with a final metallic click, the lid creaked open. The sight inside made Steve stumble back with a strangled curse. George's breath hitched as he stared, wide-eyed. The woman inside the coffin wasn't dead. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, her pale skin damp with sweat. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused, as her lips moved soundlessly. "Jesus Christ," George whispered, his voice barely audible. Steve pressed his back against the wall, clutching the cigarette in his hand like it was a lifeline. "What the hell? What do we do?" The woman's eyes slowly sharpened, locking onto George. Her voice was faint, barely a whisper, but the words clawed their way out. Help me." It took a moment for George to move, his body finally obeying the surge of adrenaline rushing through him. "Get some water," he barked at Steve, who hesitated before bolting toward the sink in the corner. As George bent closer, the woman's fingers twitched, weakly grasping at the fabric of his sleeve. "He tried to kill me," she croaked, her voice hoarse. "Arthur, my husband. He did this." George's mind reeled, the name ringing faintly familiar. It didn't take long to piece things together. The man who had been hanging around all day, pacing and watching the clock. The one with the expensive suit and cold eyes. "You're safe now," George said gruffly, though the words felt hollow. Steve returned with a cup of water, his hand shaking as he held it out. Madeline took a small sip, her lips trembling. Slowly, she began to speak, her voice growing steadier as she recounted the horrors that had brought her here. Arthur's infidelity, the fight, the blow that sent her tumbling into darkness, the sharp sting of a needle. "He wanted me gone," she said, her eyes burning with a mix of fear and fury. "For the money. For her." George and Steve exchanged a glance, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just an accident or some macabre misunderstanding. This was murder. Or at least, it was supposed to be. "What do we do now?" Steve asked, his voice tight. George looked down at Madeline, then back at the coffin. His mind worked quickly, years of living on the edge, giving him a knack for thinking fast. "We switch the coffins," he said finally, his tone decisive. "Make it look like she's still in there." "Are you serious?" Steve hissed. "This is insane." "You want her to end up back on that belt?" George snapped, gesturing toward the furnace. "'Cause that's what's going to happen if we don't do something." Steve fell silent, his jaw clenched. He didn't like it. Hell, he hated it, but he didn't have a better idea. George turned back to Madeline. "You stay hidden," he told her. "We'll handle this." Her eyes met his, filled with a gratitude that only deepened his resolve. Whatever mess they were stepping into, there was no turning back now. Steve paced the small back room, his boots scraping against the uneven floor as he muttered under his breath. George sat on a rickety stool, rolling a cigarette between his fingers. Madeline leaned against the far wall, her pale face set with a grim determination. The faint hum of the crematorium's machinery served as a steady, unnerving backdrop. "I still don't like it," Steve said, his voice a low growl. "This kind of thing, it gets people killed." George looked up from his cigarette, his expression flat. "People like Arthur get people killed. We're just making sure it's him and not her." Madeline spoke then, her voice soft but unyielding. "He won't suspect anything. Arthur's biggest flaw is that he thinks he's smarter than everyone else." Her gaze sharpened. "That arrogance will be his undoing." The room fell silent, save for the muffled clang of metal from the furnace room. George finally stood, brushing dust from his hands. "All right, then. Let's hear this plan of yours." The three of them sat at a small table, a single dim bulb, swaying overhead. Madeline unfolded a piece of paper she'd been clutching, smoothing it out with steady hands. "I've already called the police," she began, her tone measured. "I told them everything, about Arthur's affair, the assault, and how he tried to fake my death. They're taking me seriously because I gave them proof." Steve frowned, leaning forward. "What kind of proof?" Madeline tapped the paper. "Arthur's careless. He doesn't cover his tracks well. I found receipts for the poison he used, and I recorded a phone conversation where he discussed selling off my shares of the company. That alone is enough to get their attention." George whistled low. You're not messing around." "I can't afford to," she replied simply. "But here's the thing. The police need him caught red-handed. They want to see him confess or attempt something incriminating. That's where you two come in." Steve leaned back, crossing his arms. "Let me guess. We're the bait." "Not quite," Madeline said, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "We're setting a stage. Arthur will come back for what he thinks is my ashes. That's when we make him sweat. We'll use his own paranoia against him." The plan unfolded in meticulous detail over the next hour. George and Steve would keep everything running at the crematorium as though nothing had changed. Arthur couldn't suspect a thing. Not until it was too late. Madeline described the special room she wanted prepared. Dark, claustrophobic, lit only by flickering candles. It would look like something out of a nightmare. A place where Arthur's confidence would unravel. Steve, despite his initial reluctance, began to see the grim satisfaction in the idea. "So we scare the hell out of him, and then what? The cops swoop in?" "Exactly," Madeline confirmed. "But not before he faces me. I want him to see me alive. I want him to know he failed." George nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But what if he gets violent?" "He won't have the chance," Madeline replied firmly. "The police will be waiting nearby, ready to step in." The next few hours passed in a tense blur of preparation. Madeline stayed hidden in the storage room, poring over her notes and rehearsing her confrontation with Arthur. Meanwhile, George and Steve worked on transforming one of the unused side chambers into the perfect setting for their trap. The room was small and windowless, its concrete walls stained with years of soot and neglect. Steve found old candelabras in a forgotten storage closet, their tarnished metal adding to the eerie atmosphere. George rigged a dimmer switch to create uneven, flickering light. When it was done, they stood back to survey their work. Steve let out a low whistle. "Looks like a haunted house." "That's the idea," George replied, his voice grim. Night fell, casting long shadows across the crematorium. The police arrived quietly, parking their unmarked cars out of sight. Madeline met with the lead detective, a no-nonsense woman named Harris, who listened intently as Madeline explained the final steps of the plan. "Are you sure about this?" Harris asked, her tone cautious. "This could go sideways fast." "I'm sure," Madeline said, her jaw set. "He needs to see me. He needs to understand what he's done." Harris nodded. "We'll be ready." Arthur strode into the crematorium, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His tailored suit fit perfectly, as though he had dressed for celebration rather than solemnity. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of flowers, but he barely noticed. His focus was singular. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth, almost affable. "I'm here to collect my wife's remains." Steve stepped forward, his face a mask of polite indifference. In his hands was the urn, simple and unmarked, its plainness a stark contrast to the ornate choices Arthur had originally made. Arthur's brows knit together as he looked at it. "This isn't the one I selected," he said, his tone clipped, though he quickly forced a thin smile. "But I suppose it doesn't matter now." He reached for the urn, cradling it with an almost theatrical reverence. "Follow me," Steve said, jerking his head toward the corridor that led deeper into the building. Arthur hesitated for only a moment before trailing behind. The silence pressed in around him as they walked, the hum of machinery and the faint crackle of distant flames the only sounds. Each step seemed louder, more deliberate, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. They reached a door at the end of the hall. Steve pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit room where flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. "Wait here," Steve said shortly, stepping aside to let Arthur enter. Arthur crossed the threshold, the door clicking shut behind him. For a moment he stood motionless, his eyes adjusting to the faint light. The room was small, its concrete walls bare except for dark stains that might have been soot or something else. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint metallic tang. He glanced down at the urn in his hands, a flicker of unease curling at the edge of his thoughts. But he quickly dismissed it, shaking his head. "It's done," he muttered to himself. "It's over." A sound from the corner made him freeze. It was subtle, barely more than a whisper, a rustle of fabric or the creak of a shoe against the floor. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice louder than he intended. Silence. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the dim room. The flickering light made it impossible to focus, every shadow shifting, every corner seeming deeper than it was. Then she stepped into the light. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure before him. For a moment, his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The woman was pale, her hair loose around her shoulders, her dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the room seem smaller. "Madeline," he whispered, the urn slipping from his hands and shattering on the floor. The sound of the breaking urn echoed in the room, sharp and jarring. Ash scattered across the concrete, but Arthur didn't notice. He was frozen, his body rigid as though rooted to the spot. "You thought I was gone," Madeline said, her voice calm but laced with venom. She took a step closer, the candlelight dancing across her face. "You thought you could erase me, but here I am." Arthur stumbled back, his hands raised as if to ward her off. This isn't possible. You were dead," she interrupted, a bitter smile curving her lips. "That's what you wanted, isn't it? For me to disappear so you could take everything that was mine." His mouth opened and closed, but no words came. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, a way out. "You lied to me," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "You betrayed me. You tried to kill me." She took another step forward, her gaze unwavering. "But you failed." Arthur's back hit the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I didn't. This isn't." "Don't bother denying it," Madeline snapped, her tone cutting through his stammering like a knife. "I have proof. The police have proof." As if on cue, the door behind her burst open and uniformed officers flooded the room. The sudden burst of light from their flashlights was blinding, and Arthur shielded his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. "Arthur Miller," a commanding voice called out, sharp and unyielding. "You're under arrest for attempted murder and fraud." The words hung in the air like a death knell. Arthur's knees gave way as the officers grabbed his arms, hauling him upright. His face twisted in confusion, fear, and indignation all at once. "This is a mistake," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You've got it all wrong." His pleas went unanswered. The lead officer tightened the cuffs, the sharp click of metal biting into Arthur's wrists, silencing him momentarily. He turned his wild eyes to Madeline, who stood motionless in the corner, her face carved from stone. "You set me up," he bellowed, his voice trembling with rage. "This is your doing, Madeline. You—" "Enough," barked the officer closest to him, jerking Arthur forward. But Arthur wouldn't relent. He twisted to face her, his words growing more desperate. "She's lying. She's trying to ruin me. I didn't do anything wrong." Madeline's gaze didn't waver. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She simply stared at him with a quiet resolve that cut deeper than any retort. They dragged Arthur into the hallway, his shouts echoing off the concrete walls. Madeline followed at a measured pace, her heels clicking softly behind the commotion. In the lobby, a second group of officers was waiting, escorting another figure in handcuffs. Nina, Arthur's mistress, was pale and trembling, her carefully applied makeup smudged from tears. "Nina?" Arthur blurted out, his voice tinged with shock. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face contorting with anger. "You told me she was dead." She spat, her voice shrill. "You said it was taken care of." Arthur froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "I know you—" "Oh, don't you dare try to pin this on me," she screeched, cutting him off. "You're the one who planned it. I just went along with—" "Quiet!" one of the officers barked, silencing them both. Madeline lingered by the entrance, her arms crossed over her chest. She watched the exchange with a detached calm, her expression unreadable. Madeline stood by the large window in her office, staring out at the city below. The skyline, a jagged silhouette against the fading sunset, had once felt imposing, even hostile. Now it represented something else: opportunity, resilience, and control. Her father's company had been in shambles by the time Arthur's schemes were fully unraveled. Years of siphoning funds and signing fraudulent contracts had nearly destroyed the business her family had spent decades building. But Madeline wasn't one to let something so precious slip away. She turned back to her desk, cluttered with reports, contracts, and notes scrawled in her precise handwriting. The work was relentless, but it didn't matter. Each decision she made, each document she signed, felt like a step forward, proof that Arthur hadn't won. George and Steve sat in a modest diner across town, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted vaguely metallic. They'd found themselves here often in recent weeks, talking over pie and endless cups of bad coffee. "Never thought I'd say this, but I think we're on the straight and narrow," Steve said, grinning as he forked a piece of cherry pie into his mouth. George snorted. "Don't make it sound so noble. We just got lucky. If it wasn't for her—" "She gave us a shot," Steve interrupted, his tone softening. "And we didn't screw it up. That's got to count for something." George leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "Yeah, well, don't start carving our halos yet. We're still the guys who—" "Hey," Steve cut him off again, pointing his fork across the table. "We helped her. That counts for a lot." George sighed, glancing toward the window. He didn't say it aloud, but Steve was right. Madeline had done more than just save herself. She'd given them a way out, a chance to step off the path they'd been on for years. The two men weren't the only ones benefiting from Madeline's efforts. In the weeks after Arthur's arrest, Madeline had met with the lead investigator, Detective Harris, more times than she could count. At first, it had been about closing the case against Arthur, ensuring every piece of evidence was in place to secure his conviction. But as the conversations continued, they shifted. "You've got a knack for this," Harris had said one afternoon, leaning back in her chair. "Digging into the details, connecting the dots. You ever think about doing this kind of work full-time?" Madeline had smiled faintly, shaking her head. "No, but I'm happy to help where I can." And help she did. Harris began looping her into other cases, particularly those involving financial crimes, an area where Madeline's expertise proved invaluable. Together, they uncovered a network of fraud and corruption that reached far beyond Arthur's schemes. For Madeline, it was more than just a way to ensure justice. It was a way to reclaim her voice, her power, and her purpose. Back at the crematorium, George and Steve's lives had settled into something approaching normal. They'd kept their jobs, but with a renewed sense of accountability. The shadows that had once clung to them, remnants of past mistakes, seemed a little less suffocating now. One afternoon, Madeline stopped by unannounced. "You two staying out of trouble?" she asked, her tone light but her gaze sharp. George shrugged. "Define trouble." Steve laughed, earning a glare from his companion. "We're good," he assured her. "Promise." Madeline nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Good. Because I might need your help again someday." George arched a brow. "That a promise or a threat?" "Neither," she replied, her expression unreadable. "Just a possibility." By the time winter rolled in, Madeline's life had taken on a steady rhythm. Days at the office, evenings reviewing cases with Harris, and weekends spent rebuilding her personal life, a life she hadn't realized she'd been neglecting for years. She attended charity galas, reconnected with old friends, and even found time to take up painting again. The strokes of color on canvas felt cathartic, a way to process everything she'd been through without speaking a word. One night, as she packed up her supplies, her phone buzzed on the table. It was Harris. "Got another case," the detective said without preamble. "Messy one. Could use your eyes on it." Madeline hesitated for a moment before replying. "Send me the details." Harris chuckled. "Knew you couldn't resist." Madeline hung up, staring at the phone for a moment. She wasn't sure what her future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. In her office the next morning, Madeline opened her father's old journal. It was a thick, leather-bound book filled with notes, sketches and musings about the company he'd built. "You always said I was stronger than I believed," she murmured, running her fingers over his handwriting. "Guess you were right." She closed the journal, setting it carefully on her desk. The day stretched ahead, full of tasks and challenges, but also possibilities. The courtroom was silent except for the steady shuffle of papers and the occasional murmur from the gallery. Arthur sat at the defendant's table, his once proud posture hunched, his hands fidgeting in his lap. The suit he wore, tailored to perfection in his days of power, now seemed to hang loosely on him, as if the weight of his crimes had physically diminished him. Madeline sat a few rows back, her expression composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't here for vengeance. She wasn't here to gloat. She was here for justice, to see this chapter of her life come to its rightful end. The judge's gavel struck once, commanding attention. The murmurs ceased, replaced by a tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. "Arthur Miller," the judge began, her voice steady, deliberate. "You stand convicted of attempted murder, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The evidence presented against you is overwhelming, and the testimony of your accomplices leaves no room for doubt." Arthur's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward his attorney, who avoided his gaze. Madeline watched him closely, searching for any sign of regret, of self-awareness. But his face was a mask of indignation. The judge continued, her tone unwavering. "For these crimes, this court sentences you to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, quickly followed by hushed whispers. Madeline felt the words settle over her like a weight lifting, the final nail driven into the coffin of Arthur's schemes. Arthur surged to his feet, his voice rising in desperation. "This is wrong," he shouted. "She's manipulating all of you. She set me up." Two bailiffs moved swiftly, their hands firm on his shoulders, forcing him back into his seat. "This court will not tolerate outbursts, Mr. Miller," the judge said sternly. Arthur's head dropped, his words reduced to a low mutter. Madeline didn't need to hear him. She'd heard enough from him to last a lifetime. As the court adjourned, Madeline stood, moving through the small crowd with calm precision. Reporters jostled for her attention, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping with questions she had no intention of answering. She made her way outside, the crisp autumn air a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the courtroom. She paused on the steps, looking up at the grey sky. George and Steve were waiting near the sidewalk, their expressions unreadable. George gave her a small nod, while Steve offered a faint grin. "It's done," Madeline said softly, more to herself than to them. "Sure is," Steve replied. "Couldn't have happened to a better guy." George crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "What now?" Madeline thought for a moment, the weight of the question settling over her. "Now," she said finally, "I live my life. No more shadows. No more looking over my shoulder." The two men exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. "You need anything?" George said, his voice gruff. "You call?" Madeline smiled faintly. "I know." Inside the courthouse, Nina sat in a side room, her wrists bound in handcuffs. She'd made a deal, of course, trading testimony for leniency, but there was no escaping the consequences entirely. She stared at the floor, her mind replaying the moments that had led her here. The promises Arthur had made. The lies she'd told herself to justify her role in his schemes. When the door opened and an officer gestured for her to stand, she moved mechanically, her heels clicking against the tile. She didn't look back. Weeks passed, and the ripples of Arthur's downfall continued to spread. His former business partners scrambled to distance themselves, their own skeletons threatening to tumble out of closets. Investigations into his dealings revealed layers of corruption, each new revelation more damning than the last. Madeline kept her distance from the chaos, focusing instead on rebuilding what Arthur had tried to destroy. One evening, as she locked up her office, Madeline lingered by the door, her eyes sweeping over the space. The desk, the shelves lined with books and awards, the framed photo of her father. It all felt different now. Not heavy with expectation, but alive with possibility. She reached for her coat, pulling it on as the phone on her desk buzzed. "It's Harris," the voice on the other end said. "Thought you want to know. Miller isn't appealing the sentence. Seems like he's finally given up." Madeline paused, the words settling over her. "Thank you," she said simply. There was a brief silence before Harris spoke again. "You did good, Madeline. You should be proud." She hung up, slipping the phone into her pocket as she stepped out into the night. The city hummed around her, alive with movement and light. Madeline stood on the train platform, the early morning air crisp and carrying the faint scent of rain. Her suitcase sat beside her, the worn leather handle fitting comfortably in her palm. She didn't look back toward the city skyline. It wasn't that she didn't feel anything. She did. Relief, hope, even a twinge of nostalgia. But there was nothing for her there anymore. The train's whistle pierced the air, and she stepped forward, boarding without hesitation. She found a seat by the window, the glass cool against her fingertips as she settled in. The city began to blur as the train pulled away, its towering buildings fading into the distance. For the first time in years, Madeline felt unburdened. The small coastal town she arrived in was nothing like the city she'd left behind. The air smelled of salt and fresh pine, and the pace of life was slow, unhurried. It was the kind of place where strangers waved hello and shopkeepers remembered your name. Madeline rented a modest cottage on the edge of town, a place where the waves lapped against the shore just beyond her window. It wasn't grand, but it was hers, a space untouched by the ghosts of her past. She began her days early, sipping coffee on the small porch as the sun rose over the water. Her thoughts often drifted to the life she had built before everything fell apart, the pieces she'd fought so hard to pick up again. But instead of dwelling on what was lost, Madeline focused on what she could create. The local business community was small but thriving, and Madeline found herself drawn into it with surprising ease. Her sharp mind and steady demeanor quickly earned her respect, and soon she was consulting for local entrepreneurs, helping them streamline operations and build sustainable growth. Her success wasn't instant, but it was steady. Each client, each project added another brick to the foundation she was building. It felt good to be useful, to contribute to something bigger than herself. In her new town, Madeline began forming connections that felt genuine, untethered to hidden motives or expectations. Margaret, the owner of a quaint bookstore on Main Street, was the first to welcome her with open arms. "You look like someone who could use a good book," Margaret had said with a warm smile, handing Madeline a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. They became fast friends, often meeting for tea or long walks along the shore. Margaret's dry wit and unfailing kindness were a comfort, a reminder that trust didn't always have to be earned through fire. Then there was Alan, a retired carpenter who lived down the road. He'd shown up one day with a toolbox, offering to fix the creaky porch swing Madeline had been meaning to repair. "No use in letting something this good go to waste," he'd said, his voice gruff but kind. Before long, Madeline found herself part of a small circle of people who felt more like family than acquaintances. It was a new kind of life, one she hadn't realized she needed until she had it. One evening, as she was closing up her small office downtown, Madeline found a note slipped under the door. "Thank you for helping us," it read in neat handwriting. "We couldn't have done it without you." There was no signature, but she recognized the name of the business at the bottom, a local bakery she'd helped save from financial ruin. Madeline folded the note carefully, slipping it into her bag. It was a small thing, but it carried weight. It reminded her that she was capable, valuable, and needed. Months passed, and Madeline's new life began to take on a rhythm she hadn't known in years. She worked, she laughed, she made plans. And then, one crisp autumn afternoon, she met Daniel. He wasn't the kind of man who announced himself with grand gestures or loud declarations. He was quiet, steady, with kind eyes and a patience that seemed endless. They met at a community fundraiser, both reaching for the same tray of cookies. "Looks like we've got good taste," he'd said with a smile, his voice warm and easy. Madeline had laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even herself. Their connection grew slowly, naturally, like the changing of the seasons. Daniel didn't push, didn't pry. He simply showed up, with his steady presence, his thoughtful questions, and his quiet humor. One evening as they walked along the shore, Daniel turned to her. "You've been through a lot," he said gently. "I can see it in your eyes." Madeline stopped, the waves lapping at her feet. "I have," she admitted, "but I'm not that person anymore. Not completely." Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. "Good. Because the person you are now, she's someone worth knowing." For the first time, Madeline didn't feel the weight of her past pressing down on her. Instead, she felt light, untethered, free. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Madeline's life was no longer defined by the shadows of betrayal and loss. It was full of light, of new beginnings, second chances, and the quiet hope of a future built on its own terms. One morning, as she stood on the porch of her cottage, the sun warm on her face, Madeline smiled. It wasn't the kept smile she'd worn for so long. It was open, genuine, and full of promise. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. Her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Madeline's story is a powerful portrait of resilience, justice, and personal rebirth. From the moment she faces the cruelest betrayal of her husband Arthur, to her miraculous escape from death, her journey captures the essence of the human struggle against adversity. Madeline not only survives, but transforms her pain into strength, standing up to those who tried to destroy her and ensuring that justice prevails. A particularly poignant aspect of her story is how she finds a new community and purpose after breaking free from her dark past. Sincere friendships with people like Margaret and Alan, and her slow opening to love through Daniel, show that even after the greatest traumas, there is room for trust and hope. The deeper lesson this story offers is that life, as difficult as it may be, always offers second chances. Madeline teaches us not to let the past define our future, and to face the darkness with courage and determination. Her journey inspires us to believe in humanity's ability to overcome adversity and find meaning and light even in the darkest of times. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.